Gracias por la invitación. Hablaré en inglés. Yo creo que los organizadores, a ellos no les gustaba mi acento italiano cuando hablo en castellano, pero bueno, también lo tendré hablando en inglés, pero bueno. So what I'm going to talk about is merger control, and in particular challenges for merger control nowadays. And I think that there is a lot of debate these days about what to do with mergers, whether it is necessary to change the standards for merger control, perhaps to change the laws or introduce new guidelines. And in truth, actually, there are very different views about what to do. And this is basically the 2 bullet points that I'm putting there. That is, on one side, antitrust authorities are being criticized for too weak merger control. And in particular, this has been done in the context of several reviews about competition in the digital sector, like, for instance, the review which was commissioned by the UK government, the Furman report, or the review which was commissioned by Commissioner Vestager, the Kramer report. And there is recently another report which has been done by Fiona Scott Morton and co-authors, which was commissioned by CERL, which is a research center at the University of Chicago. And all of these reports basically emphasize the weak merger control, which has been done so far, and the fact that this has led to increasing concentration and increasing market power, less competition, and perhaps and especially it has been leading to an increase of dominance of the digital platforms. And I will come back to this point shortly. This means that several proposals have been made in this context by these authors, including, for instance, reversing the burden of proof. That is, it should be the firms which provide arguments to explain why the merger is good rather than the opposite. That is, rather than the antitrust authority having to prove that the merger is anti-competitive, including the request of changing thresholds for intervention. Very often what happens is that many of the acquisitions which are made by Facebook, Apple, Google, etc., are acquisition of firms which do not meet the relevant merger threshold criteria, and therefore very often they are not even analyzed by antitrust authorities. This is on one side. On the other side, in particular after the Siemens-Alstom decision of the European Commission, there has been criticism, and in particular this led to the Franco-German manifesto for the creation of national or European champions, and the German and French politicians were asking for more exceptions to be needed. That is, not only looking at competition and efficiency arguments, but look beyond that, and in particular, more control for politicians. This is the outline of what I'm going to do in the next 25 minutes or so. So I will first talk a little bit about the case for stricter merger enforcement. So my heart is more with the former group of people rather than the latter group of people. So I will try to give you a little bit of motivation and background to explain why I think, like many other authors and commentators, that antitrust authorities should be stricter in merger enforcement. And then, if time allows, I will also spend a couple of words about the proposal made by the French and the German government, criticizing the European Commission and criticizing the fact that merger control could not take into account the objective of having national or European champions. In terms of motivation, very quickly, nowadays is something that it's very and increasingly debated a bit everywhere. But there is a lot of mounting empirical evidence about a series of phenomena. And in particular, the fact that concentration, industrial concentration, has increased. Most of this evidence actually comes from the US, but little by little also this has been extended to other geographical areas, including Europe. But so that there is increasing industrial concentration, markups and profitability have been rising considerably over the last 2 or 3 decades. Not only firms' profitability has increased, but it has also become more skewed and more unequal, meaning that it has not been proportional for all the firms, but there are some firms which are becoming incredibly profitable, and others which are just getting by. And there's also been an increasing debate on common ownership and minority shareholding, which goes a little bit in the same direction. So, according to many authors, there are different variables, different phenomena, which might be responsible for the increasing concentration, increasing market power, etc. But one of these is certainly lax antitrust enforcement, and in particular lax merger control. So too many mergers, too many bad and anti-competitive mergers have been allowed. Now, you might also wonder why we care about increase in profitability, increase in concentration, etc. It's not necessarily bad by itself, but this is likely signaling that there is much weaker competition in the market, and this in turn will have important effects, both in the short run, in the sense that prices will be higher, but also in the medium-long run, because if firms are not competing, then they will not have a push towards innovating, towards investing, towards introducing new products, etc. So this is why we care about this, because we believe that competition might have decreased quite strongly over time. This is more evidence at the macro level. This is more of a macro literature, the one that I have mentioned. There is also a literature which is more specific about mergers, and in particular there is a literature which builds on serious econometric methods which look at the so-called merger retrospectives, or post-mortem, or call them as you want. That is, you try to understand what has been the effect of a merger which has been approved. So typically these sort of methods, which are based on difference in difference, an econometric method, are looking at merger which have been approved and try to see what has been their impact. And I think that it's difficult to say that the evidence is systematic, because you need quite sophisticated data in order to be able to do this sort of analysis. And so you cannot do this systematically with all mergers. But it's clear to me and to most commentators that the evidence goes very clearly in the direction that there has been merger under enforcement, and that many mergers which ended up being anti-competitive have been approved, and there is very little evidence about the other way around. This is not based on econometric work. This is just from the most recent available report from DG Competition, the European Commission, and it is about merger enforcement. During the last more or less 10 or 11 years. Now, what you see in light or dark blue are all mergers which have been cleared, which have been approved. So this is the vast majority of mergers which have been reviewed by the European Commission. In the numbers in yellow are also mergers which have been approved, but in phase 2. So only what is in, I think it doesn't work. So only the numbers in orange, which is at the top of the histograms, are those where have been an intervention. Intervention meaning approval of the merger subject to remedies, either in phase 1 or in phase 2, or prohibitions. Prohibitions are extremely rare, although there was one even yesterday. But I think it's already the third prohibition in the last 12 months. But this is pretty extraordinary because I think over the period that we are analyzing, so 11 years, and therefore excluding the 2018, 2019, what happens is that there were just 8 prohibitions sorry, in over 11 years. So there is also a number of people who say, well, when you devise competition policy, like many other policies, you should think of trying to minimize false negatives and trying to minimize false positive. And many people, when talking about merger control, think, well, basically there are only false negatives because there are very few positives, very few merger interventions by antitrust authorities. This is particularly true, for instance, when it comes to the literally hundreds of acquisitions which have been done by the large digital platforms, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook in particular. Basically, none of these, very few of them have been reviewed because they didn't meet the notification thresholds, and none of them has been blocked or even approved subject to remedies. So if this is a little bit the sketchy but evidence, but nonetheless suggestive evidence which comes from statistical data and from empirical work, I think it's even more interesting to see what happens when you are focusing on theory. Now here I will speak especially about horizontal mergers, that is mergers between companies which are active in the same sector. Vertical mergers and conglomerate mergers is something for which the jury to a large extent is still out. For a very long period, economists were siding with the Chicago School, and we are thinking that vertical mergers and conglomerate mergers cannot be harmful. In the last 10, 15 years or so, things have changed quite considerably, and there are more and more voices which are calling for a stricter review also vertical and conglomerate mergers. But I will focus for the time being only on horizontal mergers. So if you stick to horizontal mergers, I think it is fair to say, and this is not something which is controversial, that unless there is efficiency gains, then the merger has detrimental effects on prices and quality. That is both in the short term and in the medium long term. So it is on, and the idea basically is that a merger removes competition constraint. So what happens is that if before the merger a firm might think twice about increasing prices, thinking that this would lead to an outflow of its customers to some competitors. After merging with one of the competitors, this competitive constraint will be relaxed, and therefore the firm will be free to charge higher prices. So the theory is very clear on that, not controversial at all. So the idea is that there might be another force, a balancing force, though, which is efficiency gains. However, notice that efficiency gains in certain cases must be enormous in order to be able to outweigh the anti-competitive effects created by horizontal mergers. When you think of industries which are extremely concentrated, say from 4 to 3 or from 3 to 2, not to mention duopoly to monopoly, what happens is that you need very large efficiency gains to sort of counter these anti-competitive effects created by the removal of the competitive constraints through the merger. So the larger the merging party's market power, and therefore the larger the cost savings that you need in order to be able to neutralize the anti-competitive effects of the merger. Now, in particular, when you think of very large mergers, like the ones that when I was at the European Commission at DG Comp, we were reviewing, and that my former colleagues are still reviewing nowadays, we are talking about typically mergers between very large companies with extremely sizable market shares. So it is very unlikely that the mergers between such companies might lead to very strong efficiency gains. Now, so if you had to think of what are the teaching of theory, then I think that the approach should be rather the opposite of the one that is followed nowadays. That is, the approach should be that you should be extremely cautious in approving mergers. And if anything, you should have a reversal of the burden of proof. That is, with the exception of mergers between companies which are below certain threshold, small firms, etc., which certainly would not be worth investigating further. But I think that they should be the other way around, in the sense that it should be the firms which are merging. We should bring arguments to why the merger should not be anti-competitive rather than the other way around. There are also a number of other reasons, say more practical, why merger control is under-enforced by antitrust authorities in general. This is due to very different reasons. Very quickly, the first one that you meet when you start to work on merger control in an antitrust authority is that you realize that there is an extreme paucity of data and of information. The firms, the merging parties, have that information. They have the data, they have the documents, and very often it is difficult, costly, and time-consuming to get those data. But you need those data, you need those pieces of information, otherwise, since the burden of proof is antitrust authority, otherwise you would not be able to contest the merger. There are also other arguments which are more theoretical, perhaps. Antitrust authorities tend to rely a little bit too much on the possibility of entry. There is an interesting ex post analysis which has been done by the Competition and Markets Authority last year, which reviews a number of mergers and which points to the fact that the CMA had actually underestimated the barriers to entry. So I think that in general, all over the world, antitrust authorities are a little bit too quick in thinking that whatever price increase effects might appear after a merger, this will be correct by entry. There are also other arguments which go into the same direction, that is weaker to weak enforcement. I will focus in particular on one, which is referred to the last bullet point, is that very often what happens is that antitrust authorities, when they start to review mergers, a merger in particular, what they do is to focus on market shares overlap. And when there is market shares overlap between the merging parties, then things are relatively easy. But when there is very little overlap, then things start to be more difficult. And I want to call your attention to the fact that sometimes what happens is that firms might have a very little overlap in terms of product markets, but there might be overlaps upstream in the innovation markets, like for instance the agrochemical mergers like Dow-DuPont and others that 2 or 3 years ago were reviewed by the European Commission. Also, another difficulty is created by the existence of the threat of potential competitor, which is something that by its very nature is something which is not easy to estimate. And let me just add a slide on this. Perhaps the motivation comes mostly from the last bullet point in these slides. But I will start from this one. That is, people have started to discuss a lot about potential competition in mergers by thinking of mergers such as Google, Waze, Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, etc. That is mergers of a large dominant platform with a relatively small firm, or at least a firm which had not started to go outside of what it was its niche product. And many commentators think that actually most of these companies, literally hundreds of companies which have been acquired by the large digital platforms, might have evolved into the so-called next big thing, into a competitor in the future. But this could not happen because they have been bought by the dominant digital platform. So, and here I should also point out from the very beginning that it is also possible that in some circumstances, having Apple or Facebook or Google or whatever, or Amazon, which buys a small startup, might actually be pro-competitive and a good thing, because what happens is that a startup might not necessarily have all the resources, financial, labor, marketing resources that might be needed to bring their products to the market. So it's undeniable that there might be pro-competitive effects, and this for sure makes the analysis of such acquisitions more tricky, but it is also undeniable that whatever nascent competition is basically being eliminated from the beginning through the acquisitions of such startups. As I was saying, it's not only about in the digital sector that you think about potential competition. So when I was at the Commission, we were reviewing a number of mergers, including very large mergers in beer and cement between, in these two cases, at least number 1 and number 2 companies in the world. And to my mind, it's pretty clear that one of the main motivations, if not the only motivation behind these mergers, is that these companies, which are huge companies present all over the world, basically had a mandate to continue to grow. And what happens is that historically, some of them have been stronger in one country and others have been stronger in the other market. And sooner or later, the temptation to enter into the market of your rival becomes very strong. So this is a potential competition. what is the best thing to remove this threat than simply merge? And this is, in my view, what has happened in these cases. Now, the truth is, nevertheless, that these are cases which are very difficult to run for an antitrust authority, because you cannot arrive in front of the judge and simply say, I have a strong feeling that company A will enter into the market of company B. You have to support this with documentary evidence or with evidence of some other type. Perhaps, for instance, a clear trend that a company has been expanding from one market to the other. So these, and as I said before, documentary evidence is something that often is not easy to obtain. And certainly, if the main motivation for a merger is to get rid of potential competition, then you would be very careful before trying to leave a trail of such a paper around. Perhaps the most interesting piece of work in this area is work which has been done by Cunningham, Eder, and Ma last year. They have looked at the pharmaceutical sectors. The pharmaceutical sectors is particularly interesting because you can see what stage the project is in the pipeline of the project which need the regulatory approval. And what these co-authors have done is documented through very thorough and serious econometric analysis that there has been a very large number of so-called killer acquisitions. Killer acquisitions are acquisitions by a company which has a patent in one particular area of another patent which is potentially in competition. And what happens is that they acquire the company, or if they acquire the patent, which is promising to become a substitute, and quite simply, they kill it. So they don't develop it anymore. So it's very clear in this case that you cannot have any pro-competitive impact from this type of acquisitions, because the only reason why the acquisition was done was basically to kill a competitor. So in summary for this first part, and then I will spend 5 minutes on the European champions arguments. So in summary, I think that both theory and empirical evidence point to under-enforcement in merger control, and I side with lots of other commentators which are calling for a change in the approach by antitrust authority. Now, in some jurisdictions, this might call just for different merger guidelines. In others, it might call for changes at the level of regulation or the levels of law. But I think we should move towards a situation in which there is a safe harbor for mergers which involve firms which are sufficiently small, but both merging parties sufficiently small, together with a reversal of the burden of proof for other horizontal mergers. And I noticed, for instance, that the Furman review, which was commissioned by the UK government on the digital sector, calls for something like this, in particular when the acquiring parties are firms like Amazon, Google, etc., the large digital platforms, which they would call firms having strategic market status. And what the Furman review proposes is that basically there is a reversal of burden of proof. It should be Amazon and company, which should bring sufficient arguments to explain why the acquisitions is pro-competitive rather than the other way around. So on national champions, this, I don't remember if it's from the Vanguardia or El País, but this was the day after the European Commission blocked the merger between Siemens and Alstom. And as it says here, the German and the French government reacted with fury at the announcement. As a result, also, the French and the German government have prepared a manifesto calling for a relaxation of competition rules to allow EU companies to be able to grow internationally. And they have criticized EU merger control. They have called for relaxation of the rules. They have called for exceptions whereby, like it happens in some member states, the national governments or whoever, perhaps the council, perhaps somebody else, but still political powers would have the right to overturn what de facto would be a recommendation then of the European Commission. Now the argument is that in the case of Siemens and Alstom, Siemens and Alstom are facing a very strong competition from the Chinese in the rail sector, and the merger would have led to European champions blocking the merger. The world will be in the hands of the Chinese. Now, merger control allows for the creation of more powerful companies, but more powerful in the sense of more efficient companies. And this is something which is built in merger control, and it's something that any antitrust authority would consider. Now, in the particular case in point here, what happens is that according to the press release of the European Commission, but in the public sphere, nobody has seen anything to the contrary, what happens is that there were no efficiency gains which were substantiated for the merger. So it is very much unclear in which sense Siemens and Alstom would have become a more competitive company in the international marketplace. The impression is rather the opposite. That is that what would have happened is that these were two, if not the two biggest leading companies in the rail sector, and by allowing the merger, what you would have done is basically to prevent competition from taking place. And as a result, you had that not only final European consumers would pay more, but also all the European companies which are using the services of these firms. So I think this is important to take into account that to the extent that we are thinking that a powerful European company is a company which is more competitive and more efficient, merger control allows for that. If politicians have in mind something else, which is far from competition, then it's not clear to me what it is, and perhaps it should be specified better. Now, this is not to say that there might not be other goals than competition when you are doing an analysis of mergers. And in particular, also the current EU regulation admits the possibility in particular cases that you are considering public policy considerations which go beyond competition concern. So I think here that there might be a reason like, for instance, security of supply, plurality of the media, or having the media not in the hands of foreign powers, military considerations, strategic considerations. I think that it might make sense in certain circumstances to prohibit non-European firms from acquiring European companies which are operating in the energy sector, in the media sector, defense sector, or other strategic sector. However, I think that this should be done in very particular circumstances. We should be carefully enumerated and very well delineated by any regulation. And above all, I should emphasize that this goes into the direction of having an extra hurdle in merger control, not a weaker merger control, in the sense that you might have mergers which have passed the competition or efficiency criteria, which might be blocked because of these other considerations, and not the other way around, that it is simply ignoring efficiency or competition considerations. With this, I thank you for your attention. If the slides will be distributed, you will have also a link on a paper in which I elaborate on some of these issues a little bit more at length. Thank you very much.